This is the Reims Cathedral as it stands today in northern France. It is a beautiful Gothic building 80 meters in height, sublime in nature and a wonder of architecture. It was built between the years 1211 and 1275. For centuries it stood untouched, weathered through the Hundred Years' War as well as the French Revolution. Charles VII of France was coronated in this church, with Joan of Arc in attendance at the ceremony. It was seen as a symbol of both French art and culture. It was a piece of living history. And on September 4th, 1914, it was hit by a German bomb during the shelling of the city, and it burned to the ground. But here it stands today, having been reconstructed down to the most meticulous of details in the years between 1919 and 1938. And the question I have for you is this the Reims Cathedral? The famous smiling angel that greeted people as they entered the church was decapitated in the explosion of 1914. And as many pieces that could be found were collected and then stored in the cellar of the Archbishop's residence, until they were glued back together as best they could to form a mold in 1926, where an artist then filled in the gaps as best he could to create the statue that hangs on the outside of the church today. Is this then the smiling angel? Once something is broken, can it ever really be mended again? Can things go back to what they once were? Or are they forever changed? Similar to what it once was, but not actually the same. Can you ever make toast bread again? Can you ever unsay words steeped in anger that you didn't actually mean? Is the Reims Cathedral actually the Reims Cathedral? Or is it merely a reproduction of a building that no longer exists? This is the question at the heart of Nicholas Roeg's horror classic, Don't Look Now. Spoilers to follow. At the beginning of the film, we are greeted by the Baxters. John works at his desk and Laura reads a book by the fire. The children, Christine and Johnny, play in the yard, and while trying to receive her dropped ball from the pond, Christine falls in and is drowned. In their grief, the couple send Johnny to a boarding school and then move to Venice. John takes a job restoring an old church, and the two try to rebuild their lives as best they can. Can a marriage sustain the loss of a child? Or will it forever only be a copy of what a marriage once was? A hollow reflection void of what once brought meaning. Can we ever truly move past trauma? Or is it something that we will always pack with us and carry wherever we go? Doomed to always burden us and define our current truth, even if we run off to Venice or wherever you may go. In film, historically, Venice is a city of romance. The idea has been built for us within our mind of this relic of a time long past, a fantasy of love, an idyllic landscape of leisure and bliss that doesn't really belong or have a place in the modern era. A city out of time. And from a distance it is here too. There are certainly shots in this movie where the exaggerated hyper-reality of the city is present. But when looked at carefully, the idea that we have of the city has been perverted. The waters are infested with rats, and the canals are filled with bodies. A killer is on the loose, and grief permeates the air. The walkways are cramped and closing in. Eyes peer out curiously from windows and doorways. There is no love here for the Baxters to find. There is no healing, no new start. Only rampant paranoia and constant reminders of their past that force them to confront the reality of their situation at every turn. There is little outright horror in this film. In fact, almost all of what would be traditionally viewed as horror comes at the beginning, and what remains is the grief. We watch as the worst thing imaginable to these people comes true, and then we sit with them and see them as shells of what they once were, trying to reassemble the pieces of what once was, trying to find some way to move on, something that can be felt in modern horror with the films of Ari Aster, who has cited Don't Look Now as one of his favorite works and one of the biggest inspirations on his career. The second act of Hereditary is basically this film, because the way that Laura's grief manifests is in the trust of powers of the beyond. She lights candles at church and believes that she receives messages from her daughter through a clairvoyant, who she begins to spend her time with, whereas John buries himself in his work and drinks heavily, recrafting a broken memory to look as it once did, creating yet another rift between the two. Even though she only appears in one scene, Christine haunts the film, both literally and metaphorically. The medium first approaches Laura to tell her of a vision that she has over lunch in a cafe, where she claims that she could see the girl sitting beside the couple happily. And John has several encounters with a red-cloaked small figure, who always appears at the scenes of grisly crimes, whose face is always hidden. A possible vision of his dead daughter that he doesn't really want to acknowledge. But Christine can also be felt in every other aspect of the film. Her absence is tangible. Laura keeps her ball in her suitcase when they go to Venice, a fact that upsets John to find. There is something missing between these two that will never be replaced. The film is based on the story of the same name by Daphne du Maurier, who in her life often complained about adaptations of her work, and was said to only actually like two of them, Don't Look Now and Alfred Hitchcock's version of Rebecca. In fact, she appreciated the film so much that she personally wrote Nicholas Roeg a letter congratulating him on his accomplishments in adapting her story. And in the film you can see a lot of ideas that reoccur throughout her work. She often features the idea of doubles or doppelgangers, as well as extreme loss and the repercussions from that, often in conflict with each other to comment on an aspect of daily life. In The Scapegoat, an English professor travels to France and meets a wealthy aristocrat who looks exactly like him. And when they decide to temporarily trade places, he gets to experience firsthand how the other side lives. The Parasites is about the life of entertainers after their fame has faded away. The years between focuses on a widow whose husband dies at war, only for him to return after she begins a relationship with their neighbor. And Rebecca, who follows a woman who gets romantically involved with a man who is haunted by the memory of his dead wife. All of which deal with a change in perspective for the characters involved. A single event representative of a clear delineation of how things were and how things are now. A revelation that will forever change the status quo. She is an author who liked to see how people dealt with change. As Nicholas Roeg puts it, we have today and yesterday, and suddenly something happens that they hadn't planned on doing tomorrow, to which their life changed completely. Don't Look Now is a film that carries those ideas forward, about relationships, contradictions, and conflicts, about two sides of the same coin, about reflections and misconceptions, happiness and grief, spiritualism and rationalism, and in a way through that it is ultimately about trying to control that which is beyond human means, while ignoring the signs of life that should be acknowledged. Both in their own fashion share a reverence for the old way of things and trying to move on with their lives. Laura's in her growing relationship with her medium that connects her to her daughter on the other side, while John spends his days attaching gargoyles to an ancient building to appear as if they've always been there. Both are ineffectively using human ways to control the inevitability of the passing of time, trying in some way to reverse what cannot be undone. Mirrored images permeate the film. Christine is reflected in the water before she falls in. John examines photographs of churches. Police sketches are commented on. Previous scenes mirror scenes that will come later. But the biggest mirror present is the one between Laura and John themselves. And in that, Nicholas Roeg makes a statement on how he sees the difference between men and women. The women in the film seem to operate on a higher plane of existence, almost having a similar gift to what Stephen King describes as shining. The clairvoyant that connects Laura and Christine is a blind, older woman. Laura is the parent that stays in contact with their son at boarding school, and is the one who flies back to England when he is injured. She heeds the warnings that she perceives of danger, and tries to warn her husband that something bad will happen to him. The men struggle with this though. John ignores obvious signs and warnings that are given to him. He interprets visions as actual reality that sent him down the wrong path. At the beginning of the film, he ignores 3 omens: the sound of breaking glass from the yard, the spilling of water on his work desk, and the drops of blood on his projector slide, all of which, if he had paid attention to, may have prevented Christine from drowning. You can see on his face that he feels a terrible sense of doom after each of these warnings, but he does not heed them. He allows the rational side of his brain to take hold and control him. The schoolmaster can't communicate his thoughts clearly to John when on the phone, and has to have his wife explain the situation at one point. John struggles to understand the Italian characters throughout the film. The detectives follow the wrong clues. The men pry too deep in conversations, assert themselves too much. John enters the hotel manager's apartment without permission. and he eventually meets his end by pursuing what he becomes convinced is a vision of his daughter, only for it to end up being an old Italian dwarf who is killing people for an unknown reason, who is more or less unconnected to the rest of the plot. It isn't that the men are stupid people. Most of them have jobs that require a great deal of education, but they do operate in a different way than the women. There is a divide in the ability to communicate, which usually ends up harming them or at least making their lives harder. Mistakes are made constantly by the characters. John is mistaken for a pervert when in reality he was only concerned for his wife's well-being. He becomes a suspect in the supposed disappearance of his wife, and he lastly makes the ultimate mistake of taking the premonitions that he sees as reality, which leads to his death. He refuses to see these visions as what they are, or is unable to, and through this the concept of reality and perception is constantly questioned. Laura at one point says that John is doing such a good job with the restoration of the church that you couldn't tell the difference between the new windows and the real ones. In an interview in 2008, Rogue said about his filmmaking technique that finding reality is much more exciting than trying to invent it. And this can be felt in the way that he shows the city, in the way that he films the people, and the way that these relationships develop on screen. The naturalism in which their marriage is portrayed with real honesty, which makes it all the more heartbreaking. They seem like real people filmed in an almost voyeuristic style at times. The camera lingers longer than it should. We see them in their most raw form with one of the most famous love scenes of all time. Intense passion juxtaposed against the casual nature of bathing or getting dressed. Deep intimacy marred by isolation. This shot of Donald Sutherland brushing his teeth while nude is one of the most real, true-to-life moments I've seen in a film. This entire section where we see both their most personal and most mundane moments is one of the most brilliant from a filmmaking perspective of the 1970s, and shows the instances in the grieving process where things seem almost normal again. Where you forget reality for just a short time. Islands in the vast sea that is recovery. John and Laura are not able to weather that sea. They never reach a place that is recovery, or at least not together. The film makes a definite stance that there are key moments that will forever change us in our lives. Moments that, as hard as we try, will never be taken away. They will never be erased, and we will have to move on with them or die. But I don't think that is an overtly negative stance. It is just a fact, and I think the movie demonstrates that with its two main characters. Some would see Laura as a sad person, developing faith and trusting in mystics after the loss of her daughter, becoming a more superstitious person. But others would see her as hopeful, and at the end of the day, if she is happy and not hurting anybody, then why does it matter what she finds solace in? I think John is more of a cautionary tale. He doesn't accept help because he doesn't believe in the source of it. He tries to stop Laura from spending time with the medium. He obviously finds it silly and doesn't really try to hide that fact. I think the film is ultimately saying that we shouldn't be like him, and is why I think he is the one that is punished at the end of the film, while Laura is allowed to move on and hopefully find some sort of peace in her life. I think it is a deliberate message that she brings the medium with her to John's funeral at the end of the film. There is a clear theme of connecting oneself to the natural side of human existence, making a balance of spirituality and rationality, and not leaning to or rejecting one side too strongly. And at the end of the day, I think at least that Laura is probably still Laura. Her daughter may be gone, as well as her husband, but she still has a chance to be happy. She has a chance to find herself again, or maybe a new self. A person still called Laura who is radically changed by all of this, no longer connected to her past selves or what she once was. A series of portraits of before, during, and after grief.